Welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy and Ethics, PHIL 2103. We are now discussing the idea of, does God exist? And I've mentioned that there are many great arguments that in total seem to lead us to the position that at least God might possibly exist. And I said that there is no silver bullet that has ever been used that disproves completely the existence of God. That being said, there is one extremely strong argument that is used against God existing, and that is theodicy. Theodicy is the problem of evil, and it's one that for those of you who are going into ministry, you will have to wrestle with on a professional level, but every one of us has to wrestle with in some way or form in our life. The idea is simply this: if God exists, and if He is omniscient, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent, then why is there evil in the world? Now, this is not only an academic question that must be wrestled with, but it is a real-life question. I'm also a pastor, and in the last couple of years, I had a harrowing event where one of my youth punched through a glass window and shredded out the veins in his arms. That morning, I ended up at the hospital. I was sitting there with his mother in this room as the doctors came in to give the diagnosis, the prognosis of what was likely to happen. And as the bad news came, she simply looked me straight in the eye and said, "Why would your God do this to me?" Now, there's nothing you can train for in school that gives you the exact right answer at that moment. There's nothing that you can do that prepares you for that moment in life when someone looks at you and says, "Why would your God do this to me?" But you do have to have an understanding, a wrestling with that issue in your life. See, this may be either presented as a logical problem, that a good God cannot exist because of the existence of evil. It's logically incompatible. Or it could be an evidential problem. That is to say that many people will use theodicy to try and disprove the existence of God. This was originally posed by Hume, and Hume stated, "Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then He is not omnipotent. Is He able but not willing? Then He is malevolent. Is He both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil?" This is the logical problem that we must work through. Because here are the main points. The first is that evil exists. We know that innocent beings suffer in some form or another. Second, we say that an all-good, all-knowing, and all-powerful God exists. So how can we work the two of these together? Can there be such thing as an all-powerful God when pointless suffering exists? Now, to get deeper into the question, we have to ask, is there such thing as pointless suffering? What about acts of God, that is, natural disasters? What about the killing of young children? How can these things exist when we wrestle with this question of theodicy? Martin Luther King has given an amazing statement on this in chapter 8 of Strength to Love, which I hope that you have read at this point. But I most want to focus right now on your handout, A Theodicy for Pastoral Practice. This handout gives you 12 pastoral considerations. It is pulled from Thomas Oden's Pastoral Theology, written in 1983 and published by HarperCollins Press. These 12 pastoral considerations, like the argument for the existence of God itself, do not provide one single silver bullet to overcome the problem of evil, but they give us something to wrestle with in consideration. You will need to read through this, but I want to skim over those 12 pastoral considerations. The first of which says that God does not directly will suffering. The Arminian position allows for the fact that God has a perfect will that can be thwarted by us as sinful human beings. Because we freely have the ability to choose, evil is allowed to exist in the world. This is also played into the second, which is the free will defense, stating that our own free choices cause negative outcomes. The third argument is that God's power can draw evil out of any good. Romans 8:28 allows for the fact that God can take any negative situation and allow all things to come together for the good of those who love Him. Next, the argument that evil does not limit God's power. It is hardly impossible to allow the limitation that God freely welcomes our freedoms into the world. And because of this freedom, only an almighty God could allow for such freedoms that would circumvent his own world. Because God didn't want a world of robots who were not able to love him back, he allowed for us to have the ability to thwart him. But this still does not limit God's power. The next is the lessons of affliction. Evil and suffering are at times experienced as a purgative. That is, they teach us, or they provide like needed medication to us that clears out our system of evil. In this, evil choices or bad results of our freedom allow for us to see that there is problems with taking those positions. There is a problem with other evil actions, and they work to purge those desires out from us. This leads into the cleansing and educative elements of suffering. The root meaning of chastisement in the Bible is not directly punishment, but is to purify. God says that he will work with us like gold refined in a fire. And that refinement, that element of working through these problems in the world, does make us sharper. It makes us brighter. It makes us more clean and more pure. The seventh pastoral consideration is that individual suffering is socially rooted and therefore socially redeemed. Others suffer because of the result of my sins, and I suffer as the result of others' sins. When someone chooses an evil action, it sets in about a cause and event and a chain of cause and event reactions that allow for evil to make its way back to each one of us. And therefore, each one of our own evil actions has an effect on the entirety of the society around us. Number 8 says that suffering may put goodness in bolder relief. Under limited circumstances, suffering may be seen as a creative dissonance or a traditional discord from a larger harmonious meaning. Essentially, that while that we don't want to seek after suffering, when we do see that it exists, it actually increases our capacity for joy. Darkness reveals how amazing the sunshine truly is. The next one is that the values that are intrinsic to struggle, meaning that opposition, tension, and struggle are necessary for growth. If you are a weightlifter, you know that you have to break down your muscles in order for them to grow bigger. If no growth occurs because of no struggling, then atrophy sets in. The muscles shrink. But when you resist and you work against something, that's where your muscles tend to grow and tend to become larger. In the same way, when we struggle, that makes us as human beings stronger humans. Next is the proportional receptivity of good. That is to say, God gives his complete and incomparable goodness to us, which are finite creatures, in proportion to the capacity that we could receive it. Meaning that since we are finite, we are limited in time, we're limited in space, reason, imagination, even moral capacity, we are incapable of fully beholding or receiving God's goodness to the extent of its reality. The 11th is that evil is a privation of good. That is a detraction of it. Nothing evil exists in itself. If I were to turn out the lights in this room, it would be dark in here. But as long as light exists, darkness cannot. Which leads to the thought that darkness is not the opposite of light. It is merely the absence of light. There is no such thing as a dark light that I could turn on and remove light from the room or overpower the light. But I must remove light in order for darkness to exist at all. In the same way, evil does not exist on its own. It is not the opposite of good or the opposite of God. It is the absence of God, the absence of good. The last is that the world, despite its recalcitrant evils, is the best possible world. In this scenario, it says that God looked at all the possible realities that could exist. And even with all the pain and suffering that exists in this world, this is the one that was the best possible given human freedom. So as you look through these, this has been nothing more than a scratching on the surface. It is your responsibility now to go in and study through these 12 pastoral considerations. Because you never know when someone will look at you and say, "Why did your God do this to me?" In my own instance where that happened, I simply looked back at her and said, "I don't believe in a God that caused this sort of evil in your life. But I truly believe that right now, in this very moment, that God is weeping with you in ways you cannot understand. and that he wants nothing more than just to hold you in his arms. Didn't fix the problem, but it certainly was more comfort than to look at someone and say, you know what? I don't know. I don't know why bad things happen. I don't know why there's evil in this world. Because there are some things that we can look at and say, here's some possible reasons. You're never going to give any of these reasons directly to someone who's in pain. But you certainly better have something inside you that's prepared to answer questions like that when they arise.